you know this moment. Not from description, but from body memory. That specific feeling of watching yourself do exactly what you promised you would never do again. The project was going well. The relationship was finally working. The opportunity was real, concrete, standing in front of you with a clarity that rarely appears in life. And then, without warning, and without apparent logic, something in you started working in the opposite direction. You missed the deadline. You said the wrong thing at the wrong time. You pulled back exactly when you needed to be present. You found 1,000 reasons not to make the call, not to send the email, not to show up for the meeting that could have changed everything. And when the opportunity disappeared, as it always does, you were left staring at the wreckage with that specific mixture of relief and despair that only someone who knows this pattern can recognize. The explanation you reach for first is always about circumstances. The timing wasn't right. The people around you weren't ready. There were external factors that complicated everything. These explanations have a very specific quality. They are plausible enough to be believable and vague enough to never need to be proven. They protect you from a much harder question, the only one that actually matters. Why does this keep happening? Why does the pattern repeat with a fidelity that no circumstance-based explanation can accommodate? Why does the sabotage appear most intensely exactly when success is closest, as if the proximity of success is the trigger, not the obstacle? Jung didn't use the word self-sabotage, but he spent his entire life mapping the psychological structure that produces it, the functioning of the unconscious as a force that has its own goals, its own loyalties, its own definition of safety that frequently comes into direct conflict with what the conscious mind says it wants. For Jung, the unconscious is not passive. It doesn't simply store memories and dreams. It acts, it protects, and what it protects above all else is identity. The self-image that was built over years of experience and that, however limiting, has the decisive advantage of being known. Genuine success threatens that identity, and threats to identity produce responses, silent, automatic, and extraordinarily effective. This video is for people who recognize the pattern, who have seen it enough times to know it isn't bad luck, isn't lack of discipline, and isn't incompetence. It's something deeper and more specific than any of those explanations can reach. What Jung discovered about the mechanisms that produce self-sabotage is simultaneously the most disturbing and the most liberating insight you can have about yourself. Disturbing because it implies a responsibility that goes beyond circumstances. Liberating because, unlike circumstances, psychology can be understood. And what can be understood can, with enough honesty and time, be transformed. Self-sabotage is not irrational. This is the first and most important thing to understand about it, and also the hardest to accept, because accepting it means accepting that some part of you chose what happened. Not consciously, not deliberately, but with a logic that, once understood, makes complete sense within the context in which it was created. The unconscious doesn't sabotage because it is self-destructive. It sabotages because it is protecting something it considers more important than the success the conscious mind says it wants. And what it considers more important, almost always, is the coherence of identity, the continuity of the sense of self that was built from the most formative experiences of life. Jung described the psyche as organized around complexes, emotionally charged structures that form around significant childhood experiences and that continue operating in adult life as filters through which every new experience is interpreted. An inferiority complex, and this is the most relevant one for self-sabotage, is not simply low self-esteem. It is a structure that organizes the entire identity around the belief that success belongs to other people. Not as a conscious thought, few people think this consciously, as an emotional truth, as the visceral, automatic, pre-reflective feeling that something is wrong when things start going well, that prosperity is temporary, that recognition is a mistake that will be corrected, that getting too close to what you want is exactly the moment when everything is going to fall apart. This structure wasn't created by accident. It was created by experience, by the accumulation of moments in which success was punished, ridiculed, or followed by painful consequences. The boy whose successes were ignored, while his failures received all the family's emotional attention. Picture him coming home with the best grade in his class, and the room staying quiet, no one quite knowing how to meet what he brought. The girl whose intelligence frightened the adults around her and who learned slowly and without words that being less was safer than being more. The teenager whose ambition was interpreted as arrogance, as ingratitude, as a threat to the harmony of the group. Each of these experiences deposited something in the unconscious, an association between success and danger, between visibility and punishment, between going further than permitted and losing the love of the people on whom survival completely depended. The protective mechanism the unconscious developed in response to these experiences was preventive sabotage, interrupting the process before it reaches the point where the danger begins. Not as a conscious strategy, but as an automatic response, so integrated into psychological functioning that it is indistinguishable from simply how things happen. The complex doesn't announce its presence. It doesn't say, "I'm afraid of success, so I'll sabotage this now." It produces distraction, forgetfulness, inexplicable fatigue, sudden conflicts, decisions that seem reasonable in the moment, and that only later reveal themselves to have veered off course at exactly the right point. Perfect sabotage doesn't look like sabotage. It looks like circumstance. There is a dimension of self-sabotage that goes beyond the inferiority complex, and that Jung addressed through the concept of the shadow, the repository of everything that was rejected, suppressed, or considered incompatible with the identity we built to survive our specific environment. The shadow doesn't only contain what we consider our worst, it also contains what was suppressed because it was incompatible with the role our environment assigned to us. And for many people, success, the ambition, the visibility, the desire for more, is in the shadow. Not because it is inherently bad, but because it was treated as such at some formative moment. The shadow of success takes several forms. For some people, it contains the ambition that was called selfishness, the desire to grow that was interpreted as abandoning family, community, the values that define who you are. For others, it contains the competitiveness that was called arrogance, the will to be excellent that was suppressed in the name of being humble, modest, grateful for what you have. For others still, it contains simply the desire to be seen, to occupy space, to have a voice that matters, to exist in a way that doesn't constantly need to justify or diminish itself. When these contents are in the shadow, the success that would activate them is unconsciously sabotaged, because achieving it would mean becoming the person you were taught not to be. There is a specific pattern that Jung would have recognized immediately, and that appears with particular frequency in high-functioning people. The sabotage that happens not when success seems impossible, but when it seems inevitable. When the book is almost finished. When the promotion is on the table. When the relationship has reached the point of requiring real commitment. It is exactly at this point, on the threshold between wanting and having, that the shadow acts with the greatest force. Because the threshold is where identity will be tested. And identity, however limiting, prefers continuity to growth, prefers the known to the true, prefers the comfortable to the possible. Working with the shadow of success doesn't mean simply deciding to want success more intensely. It means bringing to consciousness what was suppressed, naming honestly what success would make you in the beliefs you were raised with. Selfish, arrogant, lonely, too different, too far from the people you love. These beliefs rarely appear as articulated thoughts. They appear as feelings, as that specific sensation that something is wrong when things go well, as the inexplicable impulse to diminish your own achievements before anyone else can diminish them for you. Naming them doesn't eliminate them, but it strips them of the power to act without being seen. There is a form of self-sabotage that is more subtle and more profound than the inferiority complex or the shadow of success, and that Jung addressed through his understanding of the persona. The persona is the identity constructed for social consumption, the version of ourselves we present to the world, carefully calibrated to produce the results we need to produce and avoid the consequences we most fear. The persona is not false in the simple sense. It contains genuine aspects of who we are, but it is incomplete. It is a selection, an edit, a presentation that systematically excludes the aspects that were judged unacceptable or too vulnerable to expose. Genuine success, the kind that comes from real work, from authentic expression, from contribution that corresponds to what you genuinely have to give, requires the persona to be partially dissolved. It requires you to be seen in a way that goes beyond the edited version. And for many people, that level of visibility is terrifying in a way that has no proportion to any concrete threat. The fear isn't of specific criticism, it's of total exposure, of being seen completely and judged completely, of there being no more distance between who you present yourself as being and who you are, with no possibility of retreat if the judgment is unfavorable. This fear is particularly acute for people who at some point in their lives were seen completely and judged harshly. The child whose genuine thoughts were ridiculed. The teenager whose emotions were treated as weakness or inconvenience. The young adult whose vision was dismissed before being fully heard. For these people, the visibility that genuine success requires is not a neutral goal. It is a potential trauma disguised as opportunity. And the unconscious, which learned to associate visibility with pain, acts accordingly, creating the mechanisms that keep the person sufficiently invisible to be safe, sufficiently contained to avoid being fully exposed. Liberation from this pattern doesn't begin with the decision to stop being afraid. It begins with the recognition that the fear is reasonable, that it was created by experiences that justified it, and that the present situation is not the same as what created the fear. The success available now is not the same as the visibility that was punished then. The people who will witness the current success are not the same as those who punished the earlier visibility. This recognition, made with patience and with the willingness to honestly examine what specifically is being feared, is the beginning of the process by which fear gradually loses its capacity to organize behavior without consent. But for some people, this fear has a dimension that goes even deeper than personal history. A dimension that connects not just to individual experience, but to the unspoken rules of the entire group they came from. The most disturbing pattern of self-sabotage, and the least discussed, is the one Jung would have situated in the deepest dimension of the collective unconscious. Unconscious loyalty to the group of origin. Not as a conscious feeling of obligation, but as a psychological force operating completely below consciousness that produces the specific collapse that happens when success would mean going beyond what the group of origin ever reached, beyond what the parents achieved, beyond what siblings achieved, beyond what the community, the social class, the culture of origin defines as the natural ceiling of possibilities for people like you. This pattern doesn't produce thoughts like, I don't deserve more success than my family. It produces sensations, an inexplicable physical discomfort when achievements surpass those of parents. A specific difficulty receiving praise that the parents never received. A tendency to minimize or sabotage exactly the achievements that would create the greatest distance between the current self and the group of origin. Unconscious loyalty isn't felt as loyalty. It's felt as a natural limit, as the point beyond which it simply isn't possible to go, with no articulated reason for the limit existing. Jung would understand this pattern through the tension between individuation, the process of becoming genuinely oneself, and the pressure of the collective unconscious to maintain group cohesion. Becoming more than the group of origin allows is not only psychologically challenging, it is, at some deep and pre-rational level, felt as betrayal, as abandonment, as the implicit declaration that the group wasn't enough, that you needed to go beyond to become who you are. Even when no one in the group expressed this consciously, the psyche feels the tension, and it frequently resolves the tension the only way that seems to preserve both development and loyalty, by sabotaging the development at the exact threshold where it would become rupture. The resolution of this specific form of self-sabotage is the most delicate and the longest of all. It requires the capacity to distinguish between genuine loyalty, the real love for people of origin, the honest recognition of what they gave, and loyalty as limitation, the confusion between honoring your origins and remaining confined by them. It requires the perception, earned through much inner work, that surpassing the group of origin in some dimension doesn't cancel the love you have for that group. That going beyond is not abandonment. That individuation is not betrayal. It is, in Jung's view, the most genuine contribution any person can make not only to themselves, but to the group that formed them. Self-sabotage is hard to see in yourself precisely because it rarely appears as sabotage. It appears as procrastination, but a procrastination with a specific timing that intensifies exactly when the deadline matters most. It appears as perfectionism, but a perfectionism that demands an impossible standard exactly for the project that would mean the most if it were complete. It appears as protecting yourself from expectations, but the expectations being avoided are exactly the ones that, if met, would produce the recognition the unconscious fears. The disguise is always functional, always plausible, always sufficiently reasonable that the conscious part accepts the explanation without needing to examine what is underneath. One of the most sophisticated disguises is the creation of conflict at the wrong moment, the argument that happens exactly before the important presentation, the emotional withdrawal that begins exactly when the relationship is reaching the point of requiring real commitment, the dispute that transforms a manageable situation into a crisis and ensures that all available energy is consumed by the crisis rather than by the project, the opportunity, the step that was about to be taken. The person who creates the conflict doesn't experience it as creation. They experience it as response, as reasonable reaction to something the other person did. Perfect self-sabotage always has an external culprit available. Another common disguise is illness or physical collapse that appears at exactly the most important moment. Jung understood the connection between psyche and soma with a depth that the medicine of his era rarely reached, and observed that the body frequently executes what the conscious mind cannot authorize. The headache that makes the presentation impossible. The exhaustion that appears on the weekend when the most important work needed to be done. The illness that forces retreat exactly when advancing would require the kind of exposure the unconscious considers dangerous. The body doesn't lie, but it frequently speaks for the psyche when the psyche has no other language available. Recognizing the disguise requires a quality of attention that is counterintuitive. Instead of accepting the most immediate explanation for what happened, asking what the effect was. Not what the cause was, because the cause will always seem reasonable. What was the effect? What was left undone? What was left unsaid? What was left unachieved? And then asking, if I had deliberately planned to avoid exactly this, what would I have done differently from what I did? This question is uncomfortable because the answer is frequently nothing. The real pattern and the plausible accident are indistinguishable from the outside. The difference is on the inside, in the willingness to examine the repetition with enough honesty to see what it is protecting. Understanding self-sabotage doesn't automatically eliminate it. This is one of the most important and most frustrating truths about working with the unconscious. Intellectual insight is necessary but not sufficient. You can be capable of describing with clinical precision the complex that is operating, the shadow content being protected, the unconscious loyalty imposing the limit, and still find yourself 6 months later, having sabotaged another opportunity with the same pattern wearing a slightly different disguise. Knowledge of the map is not the same as traveling the territory. What changes the pattern is not only understanding it, but working with it at the level where it lives, which is the level of the unconscious, not of conscious analysis. The first element of real work is developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between what the conscious ego wants and what the unconscious is resisting, without resolving the tension prematurely in either direction. This means, concretely, learning to notice when the pattern is being activated, when the impulse to procrastinate or sabotage or create conflict begins to arise, and instead of immediately acting or suppressing the impulse, simply observing. Naming it internally, this is happening again. The complex is being activated. This recognition, made in the moment of activation rather than only in retrospect, introduces a degree of consciousness that gradually widens the window between the trigger and the automatic response. The second element is shadow work, specifically directed at success. Not shadow work in general, but the specific contents that the prospect of success activates. This means asking, with genuine honesty, who would I become if I achieved this? What qualities in me would be required to sustain that success? And which of those qualities were treated as unacceptable in my environment of origin? The ambition, the assertiveness, the willingness to be seen, the genuine pleasure in one's own competence. Bringing these contents into consciousness, recognizing them as legitimate parts of the self rather than as threats to identity, is the work that gradually removes the charge the unconscious was using to justify the sabotage. The third element is deliberate action at the exact point where sabotage normally occurs. Not heroic action, not dramatic overcoming of fear, but the small, specific, conscious action at the moment when the pattern would be activated. Here is what that looks like concretely. You finish the chapter, and instead of opening it again to revise for the fourth time, you send it. You feel the familiar pull to cancel the meeting, and instead you open the door and walk in. You notice the impulse to start a conversation that will consume the next 2 hours, and instead you return to the work for 20 more minutes. Each of these moments is unglamorous. None of them feel like breakthroughs. But each successful action at the point of sabotage creates evidence the unconscious can begin to process. That success did not produce the consequences the complex predicted. Not once, not dramatically, but repeatedly, patiently, slowly building a new pattern of experience on which a new identity can gradually organize itself. What is available on the other side of the pattern is not simply the success that was sabotaged, it is a different identity. One that doesn't organize its sense of self around limitation, invisibility, or the unworthiness of success. One that can receive recognition without immediately needing to minimize or destroy it. One that can move forward without the protective mechanism that ensured every advance was followed by a sufficient retreat to maintain the safe distance between the self and what the self always wanted to be. This identity is not a fantasy. It is the natural result of the work, slow, non-linear, frequently 2 steps forward and 1 step back, of bringing to consciousness what the unconscious was protecting. Jung described this process as individuation, the continuous movement toward a more complete and more honest version of oneself. Individuation doesn't produce perfection. It doesn't eliminate the shadow, doesn't dissolve the complexes, doesn't make the unconscious transparent. What it produces is a different relationship with these elements, a capacity to recognize them when they are operating, to work with them rather than be driven by them, to make choices that correspond to what the person genuinely wants rather than to what the complex is protecting. The person who has individuated doesn't have less fear of success. They have more capacity to act despite the fear, because they recognize the fear as the complex speaking, not as reality describing. There is something that appears consistently in people who have broken with deep patterns of self-sabotage, something that is difficult to name precisely but immediately recognizable when encountered. A quality of presence that isn't constantly monitoring its own performance for evidence of inadequacy, a capacity to receive what is good without immediately preparing the retreat, a relationship with their own work that is sustained by something deeper than external approval, because internal approval has finally begun to be possible, not as self-complacency, as the honest recognition that what was done has value, that what was achieved was genuinely achieved, that being here, at this point, at this level, with this visibility, is not only acceptable, but deserved. If you recognized your pattern in this video, if what was described here has the quality of something lived rather than merely understood, then you are already doing the most important thing. You are looking at what most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The pattern you have is not evidence that success isn't available to you. It is evidence that something in your development needed protection at some point, and that protection stayed beyond the time it was necessary. Recognizing this doesn't change everything immediately, but it changes your relationship with what happens, transforms sabotage from destiny into information, from identity into pattern, from who you are into something you do, and that with enough honesty and patience you can learn to stop doing.